For thousands of years, people told stories about monsters, giants, and gods, tales so wild that modern audiences write them off as pure fantasy. Bedtime stories. Nothing more. But archaeologists, geologists, and biologists kept finding something strange. Underneath myth after myth sat a real fossil, a real chemical vent, a real animal nobody had a name for yet. This isn't a list of coincidences. It's a pattern. Ancient people encountering something genuinely bizarre and doing their best to explain it with the only tool they had: storytelling. Here are 9 myths that turned out to be real. Griffins, half lion, half eagle, guardians of hidden treasure in the mountains of Central Asia. For centuries, just a myth. A creature stitched together from a storyteller's imagination. Then paleontologists started digging in the exact region these legends came from, the Gobi Desert, and found something strange. Skeletons of a beaked, 4-legged creature called Protoceratops, buried in huge numbers along ancient trade routes. Classicist Adrian Mayer has argued that ancient prospectors traveling through this exact desert likely stumbled across these bizarre bird-beaked skeletons constantly, half buried in the sand, and had no framework to explain them except legend. A beaked skull with a bony frill looks eerily like a cross between a lion and an eagle if you've never seen either animal fully assembled before. What makes this connection so compelling isn't just the shape of the skull either. Ancient trade routes through this exact region were historically associated with gold mining, and Mayer's research points out that the griffin legend specifically describes a creature guarding gold in a rocky desert landscape, precisely the conditions prospectors would have actually encountered while searching for ore among these exposed fossil beds. The griffin wasn't invented out of nothing. It was reverse-engineered from a real fossil nobody could otherwise explain, in exactly the setting where people kept finding it. Dragons. Chinese mythology is packed with them. Snake-bodied, clawed, ancient, wise. Just a myth, right? Except one of the richest dinosaur fossil regions on Earth sits directly across China and neighboring Mongolia. For centuries before modern paleontology existed, farmers and travelers in these regions regularly unearthed massive fossilized bones, some so large they were sold in traditional medicine shops labeled dragon bones. Entire skeletons, clawed feet, long necks, occasionally wings, all recovered from the ground, all completely unexplainable without modern science. A culture encountering these remains for thousands of years, with no concept of extinct prehistoric life, had exactly one available explanation. Something enormous, reptilian and ancient once lived here. They weren't wrong about the bones. They were only wrong about what kind of creature had left them behind. The Kraken, a monster so massive it could drag entire ships beneath the waves, tentacles thick as tree trunks, said to haunt the deep waters off Scandinavia. Sailor's tall tale, obviously. Except the giant squid is real, and it's exactly as enormous as the old stories describe. Marine biologists studying deep-sea cephalopods have documented giant squid specimens exceeding 40 feet in length, with eyes larger than dinner plates, the largest invertebrate eyes on the planet. For most of history, nobody had ever seen one alive. They lived far too deep. But storm-damaged, dying, or dead specimens occasionally washed ashore or got tangled in fishing nets, presenting sailors with something that looked exactly like a sea monster because, in every meaningful sense, it was one. Live footage of a giant squid in its natural deep-sea habitat wasn't captured until the 2000s, meaning for the entire span of human history before that, the only encounters anyone ever had were with corpses or fragments, tentacle-scarred whales, or half-decomposed carcasses on a beach. That's an environment perfectly built for legend, a creature real enough to leave physical evidence, but rare and hidden enough that nobody could ever verify what it actually looked like alive. The Thunderbird. A massive bird god in numerous Native American traditions, wings that could blot out the sun, capable of hunting whales from the sky, surely just a spiritual symbol. Paleontologists studying North American fossil beds have identified an actual extinct bird species, Argentavis magnificens, and related giant teratorns, with wingspans reaching over 20 feet across, among the largest flying birds to ever exist. Fossil evidence places some of these enormous birds in regions overlapping with oral traditions describing the Thunderbird. Whether communities encountered surviving remnant populations, ancient bones, or simply passed down extraordinarily old inherited memory of these creatures across countless generations, the physical scale described in the legend lines up almost precisely with a bird that genuinely existed. Werewolves. A person transforming into a snarling, violent beast under a full moon, spreading terror through European villages for centuries. Pure superstition, right? Medical historians studying outbreaks of rabies throughout pre-industrial Europe have pointed to a disturbing overlap. Rabies causes aggression, foaming at the mouth, sensitivity to light, and a hoarse, altered voice, symptoms terrifyingly close to descriptions found throughout werewolf folklore. Communities with zero understanding of viral infection, watching a neighbor transform from a normal person into something violent and animalistic within days, reached for the only explanation available to them. There's also a rarer medical condition worth mentioning, clinical lycanthropy, a genuine psychiatric state in which a person becomes convinced they are transforming into an animal. Historians studying old court and medical records have found cases matching this description scattered throughout European history, individuals who genuinely believed, and sometimes convinced entire communities, that they underwent an animal transformation. Between rabies outbreaks explaining the physical horror and rare psychiatric cases explaining the personal conviction, the werewolf legend had more than one real medical phenomenon feeding into it simultaneously. Not every werewolf story maps perfectly onto a rabies case, but entire waves of historical werewolf panic align suspiciously well with documented periods of rabies outbreak in the exact same regions. Giants. Nearly every ancient culture has some version of them, enormous humanoid figures from a lost age, bones supposedly found buried in the earth by later generations, obviously just legend, meant to explain a world people didn't fully understand yet. Except paleontologists have repeatedly documented something that explains this pattern almost too perfectly. Ancient peoples across multiple continents genuinely did dig up enormous bones, just not human ones. Mammoth and mastodon fossils, with skulls containing a single large central nasal cavity, thigh bones larger than an adult human's entire leg, were regularly unearthed, long before anyone understood extinct megafauna. Historian Adrienne Mayer has documented numerous instances of ancient societies interpreting these genuinely massive bones as the remains of giant humans or mythical heroes from a bygone age. The giants weren't invented from nothing either. They were built from real bones, just attached to the wrong species entirely. The destruction of Sodom. A city obliterated in an instant. Fire and brimstone raining from the sky, described in ancient texts as sudden, total, and unmistakably catastrophic. For a long time treated purely as religious allegory. Then archaeologists excavating a Bronze Age site in the Jordan Valley called Tal el-Hammam found something that stopped the conversation entirely. Geologists studying the site identified evidence consistent with a cosmic airburst event. A meteor or comet fragment exploding in the atmosphere with the force of a nuclear detonation, flattening the city, melting pottery and building material at extreme temperatures, and depositing tiny shocked mineral fragments only ever created by extreme, sudden heat and pressure. The destruction layer shows every sign of an instantaneous, overwhelming catastrophe, thousands of years before anyone could have engineered such a story from imagination alone. Researchers involved in the excavation also noted something else striking about the site. Following the destruction event, the surrounding area appears to have remained unsettled and abandoned for centuries afterward. consistent with descriptions in the ancient text, suggesting the land itself was left unusable in the aftermath. An event violent enough to flatten a city, salt or contaminate its surrounding farmland, and terrify anyone who witnessed it from a distance would be exactly the kind of memory a culture might preserve for generations. Retold as divine judgment, because no other framework existed to explain a sky that had apparently caught fire. Sacred swords pulled from lakes and rivers. King Arthur's Excalibur is the most famous, but versions of this exact myth, a magical weapon rising from water, show up across multiple ancient European cultures. Feels like pure fantasy invention. Except archaeologists have recovered an enormous number of genuine Bronze Age swords, deliberately placed in lakes, rivers, and bogs across Britain and continental Europe. Researchers studying these sites believe they represent intentional ritual offerings, weapons ceremonially given to water as a sacred act, not accidentally lost. Excavating a real high-status sword out of a lake, exactly as the legends describe, wasn't rare. It was a documented, repeated cultural practice. The myth of a sword rising mystically from water may be remembering something that happened constantly, just described from the other direction, water receiving the sword instead of releasing it. The Basilisk. A serpent so venomous its mere gaze could kill, capable of striking down victims without ever touching them. Surely nothing but pure invented horror. Except certain real cobra species, spitting cobras specifically, can accurately eject venom directly into a target's eyes from several feet away without any physical contact at all, causing intense pain and potential blindness on contact. To someone with no understanding of venom-spraying anatomy, getting struck blind by a snake that never touched them would look exactly like a deadly gaze. The basilisk's most famous, most impossible-sounding power turns out to describe a real, documented biological capability, just slightly exaggerated from killing to blinding along the way. 9 myths, 9 ordinary, real-world explanations hiding underneath extraordinary stories. So why does this keep happening over and over across cultures that never had any contact with each other? Because ancient people weren't naive, and they weren't just making things up out of thin air. They were doing exactly what you'd do, encountering something genuinely strange, a bone too large, a light no one could explain, a venom that struck from a distance, and building the best explanation available with the tools they actually had. Mythology wasn't a failure to understand the world. It was an attempt to explain real evidence, using storytelling instead of science, because storytelling was the only tool on hand.